Well, hey, everybody, Wes McDonald here, and I want to thank you for tuning in to another episode of TigerTube. And if you can't see us, that means you're listening to us on Tigerpaw Radio, and I want to thank you for listening in.
Yeah.
And Paul, I'm so excited to get you on today because one of the things that we were talking about when we were setting up this podcast is this idea of companies, especially right now, looking at building value in their company, looking at their valuations. And I think importantly, to start looking at their companies, no matter what stage they're at, and building them to sell, even if they're not. I'm just so really excited to have you online. But as is my habit, I don't really like to fully introduce the guest. I'd like to have you introduce yourself. And if you could,
sure.
Make sure you add one interesting thing about yourself that people may not know.
Oh, okay. Well, Wes, first off, thanks very much for the invitation to share my journey and my experience with your audience, and I hope they find it both valuable and at least a little bit interesting. I've been in the telecommunications, specifically the mobile messaging aspects of the telecommunications business for a little over 24 years. This was in Silicon Valley. We were based in San Jose. We were one of the first 7 GSM operators that were launched in North America. And as a result of that broad experience, but also the very narrow experience in the context of being in Silicon Valley, I was able to get into that mix, that vibe, that culture of looking for new opportunities and, developing a soft spot for renegades, pirates, mavericks, and rascals, if you will. And I jumped from being in a large Fortune 100 multi-billion-dollar entity company, which is now known as AT&T Wireless, and jumped into a startup. And that startup became phenomenally successful. Within 5 years, we sold it. It wasn't our intent to be able to position it to be sold, but 5 years later, and we sold the company for a little over almost $500 million, around 472. I've had the opportunity and the privilege to meet 5 U.S. presidents and 5 U.S. vice presidents. Just for the record, I'll go through the list. So I met Ronald Reagan. I met George Herbert Walker Bush as a result of my running or being involved in his political campaign. I met Bill Clinton when I was, oddly enough, working for a cabinet secretary who then was running for vice president. And then I met George W. Bush when I was helping running an inaugural event for his father. And then I met then Senator Biden when I was working for Senator John Danforth, and Senator Biden's office was down the hall from ours. And this was on a late August afternoon, and August back then was on Capitol Hill. It just dries up. There are no people. And here we're playing catch, and all of a sudden one of the doors opens up, which was the hideaway door, meaning a direct access to a senator's office. And out comes Joe Biden. He's looking at us, and we're thinking, oh, we're screwed. This is it. Any aspirations that we might have had are now done. And he looks at us and goes, throw it here.
Absolutely incredible. I mean, one interesting fact, having met one president, would have exceeded my wildest expectations. That is so cool.
Yeah, of all those, the last, Reagan was the one that I spent the least amount of time. And then, oddly enough, Clinton and George W. Bush, probably the most amount of time.
What an incredible experience to think, from early on in your career in politics and then moving into what became one of the largest telecommunication companies in history, to then moving into startups and building a startup to sell for $500 million. And then on to helping other people do the same thing. It's absolutely incredible, right?
Yeah, I can't keep a job and I can't keep focused on the same industry. That's probably what it reflects.
Okay. Wow. But what I want to move to now is maybe just talk a bit is that, obviously with your expertise, you can help startups to grow their valuations to points that maybe some companies didn't really think possible. But in our space, when we're looking at technology companies, oftentimes starting on shoestring budgets or as a favor to a friend because they needed some technical help or anything else. What kind of ideas do you have to share with them to say, why should they be thinking about building their business to sell, even if they're not? And this concept is, I'm seeing it more and more, right? That this idea of even if you're not selling something, to build it as if you are. And in my mind, at least, that is the startup world, right? When you're building a startup.
Absolutely. Sure.
So maybe share a little with our audience about how you feel about that.
Well, the premise, keep in mind reflects my own personal journey and the places that I landed as a result of being where I was and then moving to the next opportunity. As I mentioned, we were in a emerging technology that at that time was text messaging at the early stages. We're talking about 1999, 2000, 2001 timeframe. I had been involved in text messaging inside a mobile network operator. So I had already a pretty good sense of what messaging was all about, both on a voice side as well as text side. Landed in this startup, and it was presented to me by a venture capitalist. And he said, I think they're missing the fact that they're just focusing on the domestic US market. The premise essentially is that a text message could be sent from what is now T-Mobile US, it used to be called VoiceStream back then, to Verizon. And Verizon back then didn't even have the means to process SMS because SMS was native to the GSM radio format. Now we're getting into too much technology here, but the reality is that it didn't exist. And we came to Verizon saying, we have a solution that is going to be able to offer a greenfield play for you to be able to get into this game. And here's why this is important. So if you look at what's going on in the Nordic countries right now in Scandinavia, there's this thing called text messaging that's really starting to take off. We think that this is going to be a much more global phenomenon. We being not just guys who were pirates and rascals and renegades, but guys who'd been inside, men and women who had been inside mobile operators going, yeah, well, we already see this trend developing. It's just a matter of time. Now, did we think it was going to be at that scale that it eventually became? No, of course not. Something as historical and culturally impacting as text messaging? Not at all. But we also knew that 160 characters was very glimpsable. We had already seen places like in the Philippines and elsewhere, at least I had, that was showing that people were sending upwards of 100 text messages a day, which was phenomenal in 2001, 2002, to think that people are spending that much time on a mobile phone sending text messages. Really?
And that much money, by the way, because I can remember the early days.
And even the way that people avoided paying money, especially in some of the developing economies, was also quite remarkable. And so I came in and again, because of my international perspective, inside a mobile network operator, was most of the time I was traveling, to be honest, meeting with the other mobile network operators. I saw a global perspective or gained a global perspective. My perspective when I came to talking to the board and the founders was, you need to go global from the start. You can't really think about this as a domestic US opportunity. You got to think about how the rest of the world is going to want to access the US marketplace. And the board agreed. They were like, sure, okay, what's it going to take? How much time and money? And my perspective there was, well, the reality is that the market is up for grabs. So the risk isn't inefficiency here. The risk is playing it too safe. And now since then, I mean, this is in 2002, 2001 timeframe, there's an entire canon around these kind of things. So, minimally viable product. Reid Hoffman has written a great book called Blitz-scaling, which I'm going to echo in much of my comments. But these things were things I kind of discovered and pursued, and then others were able to leverage it to a much higher level and then start writing books about it. But that doesn't take away from their vision, which was if you win, efficiency isn't important. Okay, if you lose, efficiency is completely irrelevant. And our perspective, when I first moved into my office, I put up a sign which was global domination. That was the objective, pure and simple. So that's the direction, the piece of wisdom that I would provide to your listeners. And then I would probably back that up with, when you blitzscale, you deliberately make decisions and commit to them, even though your confidence level is maybe substantially lower than 100%. So if you're playing, the game of, well, let's define, which is the traditional startup mentality of, let's define either what the market terrain looks like, or let's define what we do, and then make the investments in that. And then we're very focused on going from 0 to 1, the minimal viable product. And Eric Ries is spot on in all that. I'm not taking anything away from that. But the reality is that you really want to move from 1 to 1 billion, and you want to move it fast. And you start looking at the opportunities. And again, in my space, one of the things that is an advantage of being in my space is the reality of network effects. And so by even with the mindset, my business is something that we've used for many, many years. It's called Metcalfe's Law. And Metcalfe's Law is essentially a reflection that the value of a network increases geometrically with the addition of each node. So every time I would be signing up a new network operator who was going to be part of our network, and we started off with 5 and then 50 and then 25, and 5 years on, we were up to 175. Now that's not bad out of 1,100 operators, because just like everything else, there's this 80-20 rule. 20% of the world's operators are generating 80% of the traffic. And we had focused on what were those 20 for whatever, for whatever reason in terms of our initial opportunities. So we then pursued that, with vigor, as they would say. And that was the mentality, and there weren't questions that came from the board as to, what do you mean you're going to spend $200,000 on travel this year? It was, okay, yeah, we see what you're doing, and this is essentially an operating gain. And even when I described all of this as part of the strategy to the board, I was laying out the reality that it's both offense and defensive at the same time. Because when you engage in this kind of blitz scaling or going global from the start, you take the market by surprise. And this was an opportunity. This type of technology was something that was a greenfield play. As I said, there was no such thing as messaging interoperability. Now, wasn't we were the only guys who were doing this. The nature of technology usually isn't unitary. It's not one person that emerges. It's usually a bunch of them. Green shoots develop, and they're all kind of similar, but they may be a little bit different. And then there's that traction that occurs that I mentioned, going from 0 to 1. But we decided, okay, we wanted to play the game faster rate. We set the pace. We then were able to leverage our lead to build long-term competitive advantages, which is exactly what you were talking about as to how do you position yourself for the sale. Well, we didn't think of that. We thought of a sale as a liquidity event. And the liquidity event could be an IPO, or it could be bought. We could be bought by somebody, because we were a fast-growing, sexy little company, and we had a different vision. And when I presented all this to the board in terms of our strategy, I did discuss the reality of this would be accretive. That, again, back to Metcalfe's Law, the power of our network that we will build out will give us an advantage, not only in terms of serving our customers, i.e. those mobile network operators, but also creating a moat from others being able to take advantage of it. And in many cases, the other aspect of this business is that it's collaborative and cooperative at the same time. Because, as I mentioned, there are 1,100 operators. And the way the business was for the first 3 years, we were all getting our own beachheads. And some of us were getting beachheads offshore. So we had more beachheads than the other guys. But at the end of the day, there were certain beachheads that I couldn't get to, and there's certain beachheads my competitor couldn't get to. So we had to cooperate to be able to say, yeah, okay, you're serving AT&T at the moment. We're serving Verizon. I can get you messages into Verizon. You'll have to send them directly to us. If you go to Verizon, they're just going to go, we want you to talk to InfoMatch first, because they're essentially our agent. And the same thing, if I had wanted to talk to AT&T at the time, AT&T would have said, well, you need to talk to Mobile Spring, who is managing the same type of service. So that aspect became another differentiator in the game. And then the last piece in all this, as we discovered, as you are establishing that leadership role, you get more interest from investors because they like to invest in leaders. And that became another dynamic and others, companies came to look at us, and we weren't thinking about selling, but eventually, somebody came with a very interesting offer. A smart guy named John Chen, who was at the time the founder and CEO of Sybase, which was an enterprise resource planning and customer relationship management company. And his vision was, I think I can utilize text messaging in our software platform. And you guys could be providing that to me. And that was the aha phenomenon, even the sphincter phenomenon as to, damn, why didn't we think of that?
I love it. And, I've heard a few things here, and I just want to, make sure I'm on the right track. But I think most companies are capable of doing that 0 to 1. It's kind of like, figuring it if you actually have something, right? And it's like, yeah, it looks like, we're obviously doing something right. But that acceleration, that leadership that you're talking about, that's the part that I think most companies miss, right? And if I'm correct, that's what you're saying, is they've got to really focus on that acceleration, that leadership. And in the end, when people see that leadership in the marketplace, that also drives value in the company, right?
That's right. Part of my training as a political operative and political manager was listening to a lot of military strategy, because it's just part of campaigning. And so I went through a program that brought in military strategists, et cetera, and how you apply military campaigning and warfighting in the same context as running political campaigns. Well, guess what? The same thing can be applied to marketing and the private sector, okay? And that dynamic was driven by, I remember, a mantra that I started to really embrace, which was shoot, run, maneuver, meaning take the shot, move to another position, and then start thinking about where you need to go next. Repeat, 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 which came from guerrilla warfare fighting. So it's the same concept of, if you're looking at this as an incremental play, then you may be doing this for a very long period of time. If you want to be looking at this in a different fashion, you've got to be able to run, shoot, and maneuver, shoot, run, and maneuver, or pivot, constantly pivoting. So, and then also, even in the context of shorter timescales, I looked at, when I was first tasked with segmenting the marketplace, as I mentioned, at the time, there were 1,100 mobile network operators out there. And one of the board members like, well, how are you going to attack this market, especially since it's just you at first? So what I did was essentially segment it out in terms of the dynamics of the American market and the offshore market, and who, and this was an easy thing for a telco guy to do, because all I did was look at long distance voice calling and the distribution of voice calls all around the world, because I knew that messaging was going to mirror that distribution of traffic all around the world, and then be able to go to the next level down as to which operators are getting most of this business. And at that time, it was, enterprise related business, meaning road warriors, business guys who were doing this. And so it was an easy thing to be able to segment, and then brought to the table as to, I'm going to engage in what I called parallel priorities, which is a complete misnomer. I mean, there's no such thing as parallel priorities. There are priorities. They're not a whole bunch of priorities. But my perspective was the pivot aspect, so that I looked at that 1,100, condensed it down to 125, then condensed it down to another 25, and then engaged those 25. And then if need be, I killed my children. And what I mean by that is, I started looking at, if I got traction with, let's say, T-Mobile UK versus Vodafone, which was exactly the phenomenon, I discarded Vodafone as a priority, and then I pivoted my resources, meaning my time, my money, my people, my talent, even the technology, to land that first beachhead opportunity, which was T-Mobile UK, which is exactly what we did. That took 6 months. Vodafone took 2.5 years.
Wow. Yeah, it strikes me what you're saying. I've heard a similar kind of approach, in sort of customer management, right? The ABC model, where
Hmm.
obviously you groom your A customers, you're do everything you can to keep them happy. Your B customers, you're grooming them to become, those A customers, and your C customers, you're chopping them out, right? So it sounds like the kinds of relationships and partnerships and strategy go after, you have to have that same pivot mindset, which is don't be afraid to cut the chafe, right?
Exactly. And you touched about partnerships as well, again, because I started applying the things lessons I had learned in the political world back to the partnerships, which in the political world, in the policy world, you're talking about coalition development, coalescing people that may have divergent opinions, but getting them marshaled around the common goal and common objective. And so we did the same kind of thing. So I started looking at the suppliers of the company that I was involved in. And most of what we did, we didn't create it ourselves. We were essentially building a stack of functionality, wrapping it all together and going to market with it with these various partners. Well, I had already known that those various partners were oftentimes suppliers of services or technical solutions to mobile network operators. So I started to try to influence the influencers, go to them directly and say, look, I'd like to have this intro in terms of a referral. Here's what the opportunity is. Here's where we're going. And that's how we opened additional doors and were able to pick up our pace and close more deals.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think, our listeners can really, grab from that when you have these parallels, which, things they may recognize from the outside world in politics and military, such as coalitions, and how important those partnerships are, right? And I love what you said earlier. I think that, we really do have to do, actually, maybe it's a segue into my next question, because I was thinking that when you're a startup, and you work with them and tell them, hey, look, you're going to go to 0 to 1, and then we're going to go from 1 to, a billion in a hurry. Well, they don't have any legacy, right? A lot of people watching this have been in business for a long time already. They've
Mm.
already, had slow growth, or maybe they're not growing the way that they want to. What advice might you have for them to start, behaving like a startup, even if they've been in business for a long time?
That's, the toughest thing as a consultant that I've been involved in, and I've done probably over 100 different consultancies over the last like 15 years or so. Um, the reality is manifesting that change is clearly the most difficult thing to do. Ideas are great, but execution is everything. And so it becomes a matter of how can we do this in parallel. There's a great book by a Harvard Business School professor named Clayton Christensen called The Innovator's Dilemma. And it talks about companies that focus on their performance engine exclusively, meaning companies that are legacy players in an environment, and they're attending to how well are we doing as compared to yesterday to where we want to be tomorrow based on what we've been doing for the last 25 years or 10 years or 3 years or 5 years, whatever it might be, in the premise of your question. And they fail to realize that there are adjacent players, similar technologies, who have a little bit more aggressive mindsets, who then attack what they've been doing and steal the business away. And he wrote a number of different books along this premise. Another one's called The Innovator's DNA. I would recommend it to anybody who's trying to face this at the moment. So it's essentially a guide to be able to think differently, act a little differently, because that's really what your premise is. And that's a very difficult thing to do, because as human beings, we become quite accustomed to that. Or we're just maniacs who are going from one thing to the next, the serial entrepreneurs, so to speak, that we all run into. And God love them for what they're doing. But it's, if you've got something where you've gotten traction, then it's, do you want to abandon that? Or how can you do both at the same time? Another way of accomplishing that is bring somebody in who can help you along. Essentially like a consultant, or perhaps the right type of talent that has been in that type of environment relative to, let's call it a run and gun startup, so that you can then build upon their experience and their expertise and draw upon their instincts that aren't going to clash with yours.
I love that. And it's this idea that um, there's a story. I don't know if it's true, but it's certainly a great urban legend, which is that Henry Ford was invited by, journalists who were actually trying to trash him, to sort of illustrate how silly of a person he was and how terrible he was as a businessman. And he set up a schedule and said, sure, come into my, office on this date. And when the reporters came, he made some small talk for about 5 minutes and eventually said, okay, before you ask any questions, just give me 1 second, and opened up the side door, and in walked, 10 people, right? Other great minds and people that were helping. And they said, well, that's not fair. We came here to interview you. And his answer, his response was, well, if you're here to interview me, you can't do that without talking to these people because I rely on them for, for what
Absolutely.
they do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a great book by a guy named Stanley McChrystal, who's a retired four-star general in the United States Army who retired at the peak of his career because of issues that he made about President Obama at the time. But those things happen. He was the head of the Special Operations Forces, Special Operations Command for the entire military. So he covered everything from Air Force guys to Green Berets to Navy SEALs, to the helicopter pilots, the whole 9 yards. And while he was prosecuting, he was responsible for prosecuting the war in both Afghanistan and Iraq. He put together this concept of teams, because every day he had a meeting, and his meeting had 1,000 people at times involved in it. He essentially had, I think there were 35 different American intelligence elements in his efforts, and over 70 from the Allies, especially in Afghanistan, as well as, and what they would be doing is snapshotting the activities of the attacks every night, meaning the American attacks, looking out for Al Qaeda, etc. Every day they were doing this. Every night there were special operations guys who were engaged in this, and he was able to put together a process. And it wasn't him alone, and he wasn't having 1,000 people talk for 3 minutes in this meeting, and he actively, I've listened to him, read his books. They're really, really good, and it speaks specifically to, you're only good as the team around you.
Yeah, I love that because, you said also you can either hire someone to come in, or a consultant. You can get someone who has some expertise like you do, to be able to help them build that roadmap. But it just really opened up my mind in the sense that sometimes it's not, we that have to do the things to change. Sometimes we just actually have to bring in the team that will do that for us.
And I'll speak to this directly again from my own experience. And this isn't to take away from the power, the influence, and the capability of founders. But I'm going to take this again from McChrystal. He's interviewing a guy from Ford, who is a former CEO of Ford. And I remember listening to this as a podcast. And the Ford executive, I can't remember his name, but he was the one who was CEO of Ford and then left Ford and then became head of the Michigan university system for a little while. And he pointed out that oftentimes founders who are on the edge of the commercial activities, because they are founders and they are rascals, renegades, etc., they may not follow process very well, but it's really good that they execute quickly. But oftentimes they think they have a unitary perspective, meaning the only perspective and the greatest perspective and greatest value in a decision-making process. While the guy who might be more of the process, commercial, large entity background, he's going to have a perspective of, well, I need to get the best information I can from the best people that I have. So they gather all that together, and it's not one decision that's being made. It's one decision based on multiple decisions that have already been made. And that's, that takes a lot of efficiency. That also takes a lot of ego busting, especially from a founder's perspective. But that addresses exactly the question and the point that you were being raised.
Yeah.
Step away so you have a better sense of, what do I need? And that's why, consultants exist. So,
and I got to think that when we're talking about building your business to sell, whether you are or not, that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but But what you speak of when a founder remains the founder and they start building these teams of teams, I got to think that somebody buying a company would say, we need to know this machine can run on its own, right? That regardless of who's at the head, that it's built in such a way that what we're buying is going to be good, right? Is that true, or am I missing something
Absolutely, it's
altogether?
true. So, again, from my own experience, I've been in the startup that I mentioned that became very successful. Within 6 months of my arrival, it turned out that all three founders had been exited, and the people that were being brought in, including myself, were much more experienced executives in the space. Why was that? Well, they took the VC money, and the VC's money was essentially saying, we're going to be changing some things. There were some other circumstances involved as well. No, there's no such thing as pure as the driven snow. We're all human beings, but the reality was that the VCs put a different management team in place, which then shepherded its growth and development over the next 5.5 years, which eventually led to that liquidity event. In another environment, I've been involved in a number of different mergers and acquisitions, primarily in larger companies, and one that I was involved in was called Cineverse. And it's very well known that Cineverse has a growth mentality that's based on acquisition. That's their corporate growth thesis. And they do it quickly. And in each case, I was part of the team that would be doing the rationalization, the due diligence, making those decisions as to who's going to stay, who's going to be leaving, et cetera. And in almost every case that we acquired a company, and I think I went through 4 acquisitions, and they were pretty substantial, upwards of 720 million on one of them.
Oh, wow.
And within about a year, the founders or CEO or the management team of that company were gone. And that's part of culture, but that's also a matter of that's how they assimilated and rationalized and made the acquisition accretive as fast as possible. That's just part of it. It's not
Yeah.
always that case, but
No. But I love this idea that, and I've been through an acquisition myself, an organization that I had some interest in myself, was acquired and everything else. And
Mhm.
I was, I guess, an early sort of cog in that wheel, and not necessary for the, continued growth afterwards, right? Nothing personal. And it just gets me thinking that there are different roles, different people for different stages of growth, right?
Yes.
And if that's an important way to set up your company for that kind of growth, is to keep that in mind, right?
Yeah. That takes, it's really tough for any founder, again, not taking anything away from them. In fact, this is praising them in the context of that's a really tough thing to do, to step back. There's a great course at Harvard Business School that I took called Leadership. And one of the things that I remember from that was now 30 years ago, where the professor was like, you need to be able to step outside of yourself, like you're watching yourself dance on a dance floor and you're floating above that disconnects you from all the froth, the hubris, the ego, whatever it might be, and allows you to make a better decision in terms of being a leader. And I was like, wow, that's really good. It's a long
Really
time,
important.
but that's that made a big impression on me.
Yeah, and I think, especially for, like I said, in the technology space, with the organizations that I work with on a regular basis, is that there's nothing wrong with being a smaller organization, as some people would call a lifestyle business, or
Mhm.
something else. But if you do want to grow, that I think what I picked up from this, any rate, is that team of teams mentality, that understanding yourself, your role, either as a founder or some other part of that growth strategy, understanding where it is, how to pivot, and when to get out of the way, right?
Yeah, what you forgive me, but you've just hit on. So we started talking about, at the beginning of this conversation, Chinese New Year, right?
Yep.
And we've talked a little bit about strategy, and we've talked about vision, and we've talked about military engagements and military strategy and political strategy. And so, there's a Chinese general from, I think it was 500 BC. So I think his pronunciation is Sun Tzu.
Yep.
Sun Tzu, for those Laoways, meaning white guys, or foreigners, as the word translates in from Mandarin. SUNTZU for those of you listening out there. Know thyself, Know thy enemy. Do not fear 100 battles.
Wow.
We just, how prosaic is that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what you're in for.
Yeah. So
I love it.
perfect. Yeah. Brings it all around.
Well, that's great. And hey, listen, I know in respect for obviously yourself and for our audience that we are starting to wind down to the end of the interview here. And I would say that I think it's important. Sometimes I like to call this the impossible question. And for everything that we have, sort of talked about
I
today.
saw this coming, and I'm still. I thought maybe you might, I would get lucky and avoid that. But go ahead with your question.
Yes, the impossible question. If you had just one piece of advice for people to get started on this journey of building their businesses as if they were going to sell them, even if they're not, what would that be?
Who dares wins. So, who dares wins is the motto of the Special Air Squadron, which is the Special Forces Office element of the British Air Force, the RAF, the Royal Air Force. So, in that same vein of who dares wins, don't hold back. This is a multi-answer question to a single part, or multi-answer answer to a single part question. Don't hold back. Follow your vision, and don't hold yourself back. Embrace that opportunity. Go be a global dominator. It's possible. If not you, who? If not now, when?
And Paul, I cannot thank you enough for joining us today and for sharing your expertise on strategy and growth with our listeners and viewers.
Well, thank you, Wes. I very much enjoyed it, and I hope that your listeners and viewers enjoyed it as well and learned something, had a takeaway from it. It was a delight having the conversation with you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here.
Well, that's great. And for everyone out there in Tigerpaw land, remember, keep learning.